It's really good to be here. Thank you, Father Chris, for giving me this opportunity to preach to you this morning. Have you ever known somebody that complained so much about so many little things that you wanted to sing this song to them? Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrows. And you think if they'd listen to that and echo back to them, they would know that their sorrows were minimal compared to other people. Yet we've all known people like that, right? And I once had a parishioner, and one of the features of people like that is they want to control everything, right? Keep it close so that they can make sure that it'll be the way they want it to be, right? And inevitably, their paths get crossed with other people, right? And one of those people, one time, was here and believed that she knew everything. And there was another person that I got that volunteered that had a heart for something and was gifted in that area and motivated, right? That's what we're looking for. We want you to be gifted and motivated, right? So remember those two things when you volunteer for something. And that person began the task that they were set to do with my commission and had to take something down. And when they did, it affected that other person badly. That person, right? That other person. And she came into my office because she found out I had commissioned this, screaming so loud you could hear her down the hallways. Why are you so mean to me? And I was listening and I thought, I've never been mean to you. And furthermore, I thought, why am I listening to this, right? Why would I subject myself to this unless there's something to learn, right? And I did learn something, right? I learned that I didn't want to be that person, right? I didn't want to get so angry and out of control that I affected everyone around me. There is a reason why we have to be civil to one another. It brings peace and harmony. Now, when somebody complains all the time about little bitty thing, there's another song that I want to sing to them by one of my favorite groups. You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want, by the Rolling Stones, right? That song has been featured in a lot of movies, but one of my favorite movies, some of you have heard me preach about this movie before, so bear with me, The Big Chill. A story about a group of young people who lived together in college, and then they drifted apart as they became adults, and they came back together again on the occasion of their friend Alex's funeral. Alex had taken his own life, and they were trying to make sense of it. And the preacher, who was much older and couldn't understand these young people either, got up and he said, "Where did Alex's hope go?" Right? And then later on, at the end of the funeral, his good friend, Karen, goes and plays one of his favorite songs. You can't always get what you want. And all of his friends start smiling because of Alex's message to them. You can't always get what you want. Where did Alex's hope go? That's a good question. Alex's hope was dashed on the umbrella of unmet expectations. Just as that woman came in my office, all angry and upset, it was because of unmet expectations. And we might title this sermon today, for those of you that are taking notes, Unmet Expectations, right? In the story from Amos, thank you for reading that, Michael, Amos is the prophet speaking to the people of Israel in behalf of God. That's what prophets did, right? And Amos says to the people, this is the way you've lived your life. You have profited off of those that are less fortunate than you. You've built your life on the backs of those people that don't think like you, that don't look like you, that perhaps don't live like you think they ought to. And because of that, this is what's going to happen to you, right? Now, we like to think of prophets as telling about what God is going to do to somebody if they don't do right, right? Because there's got to be somebody that's punished, right? I mean, I'm glad I'm on the inside and everybody else is on the outside, and those people are going to be punished because God's going to do that to them, right? But I want you to think differently this morning. I want you to think that the prophet is just telling it like it is. If you behave like that person, the consequences will happen to you, because there's always consequences. Don't think there's not. That your circle of influence will shrink. In fact, it will shrink so much, as Amos told the people of Israel, that it will lead to your destruction. You will find yourself isolated, afraid, and alone, and singing that song. Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Nobody knows my sorrows. In the gospel story today from Luke's gospel, the gospel that follows the story that we read last week, that Father Chris preached such a great sermon on, the Good Samaritan. Y'all know that story, the Good Samaritan? If you were here last week, you heard it. In this story, Jesus enters a village and is invited into the house by Martha. Now, we know about Martha in John's gospel. She has a sister, Mary, and a brother, Lazarus. But Lazarus isn't named in this story, but Mary is. Martha welcomes them in, Jesus and his entourage. Now, we had a party at our house Sunday night. We had 90 people there that we counted, and there were probably a few we missed. It wasn't a great party, those of you who are here. Anyway, this is going to be a party. Martha knows that, and just like we do when we have a party, we scurry around and start doing things. And Martha did that. She scurried around. She starts preparing. All the dishes have to be the right dishes, right, with the right food in them, and the food has to be special because she wants those people to leave satisfied and going out and telling others. Martha's such a great cook. She's a great host. Oh, my goodness. And everything has to be just so. Martha's busy in herself. And Mary sits at Jesus' feet. She's trying to glean something from this man of God so that she might learn how to be more like him, right? And see that the glass is never half empty. In fact, it's always full in Jesus' world. That's what Jesus tells us. And Martha gets all excited. She's torqued up. She's mad. And she goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, Mary's out there doing nothing while I'm slaving away, making things so special for you and your friends. And can't you make Mary do right? If I had $1 for every time a parishioner told me, can't you make that person do right? I would be a rich man. And Jesus looks at her. As always, Jesus looks with love, and he says, Martha, Martha, take a chill pill, right? You're so busy and worried about so many things. There's only one thing that's needed, right? Mary has chosen the better part, and you can't take that away from her. Now, I think it would be easy for us. Oh, and then Martha goes, when Jesus says that, why are you so mean to me, right? And we didn't hear that, but that was in there. And now we get the story. What are we going to do with it, right? We can indict Martha, right? You can indict Martha. You don't want to be a Martha, do you? So busy that you forget about everybody else. You know, I'm busy. And then get mad when it doesn't work out the way you want it to. I don't want to be that person, do you? You don't want to be that person, do you, Chris? No, pay attention now. You can't learn if you don't pay attention. Here, drink some water. I know you like water. Here we go. Drink that. Okay, here we go. It's full. We could do that. We could blame Martha, or we could blame Mary. We could say, wait a second, that story last week, the Good Samaritan, Jesus says that's the man. He's the one that did the neighborly thing because he did something. The others did nothing, right? And Mary's sitting around doing nothing, right? So it seems like we could blame Mary. She's the problem, right? I don't want to be like that person, right? But I think if we did that, we would lose sight of the essence of this story. It's easy to blame. Some of you do that from time to time. I'm not going to name names, but when we start blaming others, right, there's something that happens. I'll get to that later. What is the essence? Where do we find the essence of the gospel in this message? Well, I think you start with Jesus, don't you? We're going to preach about Jesus this morning, you know that. Jesus says there's one thing that's needed, right? Y'all hear that? One thing that's needed. And then he doesn't tell us what that is. He just says Mary chose the better part, right? Well, wait a second, don't leave me hanging here. What's that one thing that's needed, right? When I left seminary, I went to the cathedral for a year. I was at the Cathedral Church of the Advent in Birmingham, and I worked under some incredible priests. The most incredible was Larry Gibson, the dean of the cathedral, a brilliant preacher. I mean, you would listen to him. I got to introduce him one time, and I said the first time I heard him preach, tears came to my eyes. I had eaten some onions earlier, but that's another story. Larry was brilliant, and he was an organizational genius. The church was growing the whole time he was there, and they had 2,700 communicants. Imagine that, 2,700 communicants. And those of us looking in from the outside thought, this is a well-oiled machine. Everything's perfect here at Cathedral Church of the Advent, right? But there was conflict. In fact, there was such a bad conflict between Larry and the staff that we had to have a special meeting that I got to attend. And the facilitator was trying to make sense of all this and bring harmony to the story. Because if you don't know this, God wants harmony. God wants us to be at peace and live together in harmony so that something can happen beyond our abilities. And I thought conflict, I got to pay attention to that, right? Because I'm going to be a parish priest. I want to know about conflict. So I witnessed one day in the hallway during the Lenten lunches, if y'all have ever been to them, they're spectacular. And they raise so much money for charity. That's one of the biggest money raisers of the whole year. I witnessed two leaders in the church, two women in the hallway, began to shout at one another. They may have been saying, "Why are you so mean to me?" Right? But they were obviously angry. And then they saw me. And when they saw me, they both looked ashamed. And they walked away. Do you know why? Because they didn't want to be perceived as that person. They didn't want to reflect that image as who they were, right? Because nobody wants to be that person that loses control, that gets so angry, that makes other people miserable because of their presence. But let me tell you, that is the human condition. So anyway, I went to Larry and I said, "Larry, tell me about this. I saw this happen," right? And he said, "Steve, did you hear Rabbi Friedman speak the other day?" I said, "Yes." Edwin Friedman was a master of dealing with conflict in organizations, particularly in religious organizations. And he'd written a couple of books. And he said in that lecture, the source of all conflict, right? They write this down. The source of all conflict is when one person exercises their will over another, right? Be it between friends, a couple, family conflict, workplace conflict, school conflict, in a religious organization conflict, even between two countries. Conflict arose because one person exercised their will over another, and then the other says no, right? And unmet expectations led to more conflict, right? Well, I looked at this and I thought, well, conflict is obviously not the thing that's making this work well, right? What is it? What's the essence? What's that one thing that's needed? I got a call to Wetumpka where they had 100 communicants. And I thought, I'm going to take everything I've learned at the cathedral with 2,700 communicants, and I'm going to bring it to this venue with 100 communicants. Can you imagine that? How do you do that? How do you do that with any kind of you had to be really skillful, which I was, right? And I thought, no, I could never do all the programs they do. Never. I wouldn't have the horses to run them. I wouldn't have the resources to pay for them. But what was the essence? What was the one thing that was needed, right? And I began to look at that. How can I get that in this new venue? And then I realized something before I even got started. It was already there. I couldn't bring it there. We're not inventing the wheel here. The church has been going on for 2,000 years. We have to find that essence and we bring it up to the surface, make it more important than anything else. And so I began to ask questions. I began to listen. Listening's a pretty good thing. There's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Pay attention. So I said, there's got to be some questions that we ask. And I realized the first question to ask was, who am I? Right? A novel question. But more particularly, because we're the church, who are we? Right? And it has a two-part to it, this question. Why are we here? Right? Who are we and why are we here? You start there and you begin to understand that. Right? And Father Chris is doing a good job of getting you all to focus on that. Keep telling them that. Who are we? Why are we here? What's our... Have you been listening? Okay, good. All right. And then... the second question is really important. Where is my heart leading me, right? Because if your heart is leading you somewhere, you're likely to end up in the place you're supposed to be, right? So where is my heart leading me? Doing things just for the sake of doing things is irritating. I want you to know that. If you just doing things for the sake of doing it, just stop it. Stop it right now. Go where your heart leads you. Where is my heart leading me? Where is our heart leading us? Right? And the third question is the most important of all. What is the highest value? Now, we all have values, right? Some people value control. It's a fact. You've been around them. You know what it leads to, conflict, right? Some people value having everything the way they want it to be, right? Which is part of control. But if we have a value that's less than the ultimate, right, we're going to come into conflict because somebody else is going to value something differently. Larry Gibson told me that day. He says, whenever there's a group of people working on a project, there's always going to be differing ideas. And if people are so strongly wedded into their ideas being the right idea, there's going to be conflict. So what is the highest value? And how can we reach to that? So that if we begin with who are we, why are we here, follow our heart, and then make sure that God Almighty is the highest value that we use to decide on anything that happens. Over the years, I began to develop a philosophy and a theology of what is the church? What is the church? Church or not church, right? And a lot of what is not church is extraneous. It's things that we think have to happen, right? You got to get that budget. You got to make sure that budget is right, Chris. Don't you mess with the budget. That's a paramount, sacrosanct, no ifs, ands, and buts. And you got to have policies and procedures that are perfectly aligned with your understanding of the way things. We might use the government as a template, right? Maybe the army, right? Is that church? No. So what is needed? What's the one thing that's needed? Well, I began to look at that and I thought about it. And once I got to sit in a panel of successful churches, right? There's three of us, and we were a church growth conference, and I was one of the experts, right? I had a briefcase that made me an expert. So I walk in, and I see these other two fine priests, sitting next to me, and I looked at them, and I thought, why are they here? They're not experts, right? And then I realized, remember that story about when you point your finger at somebody else and find them blame, right? What happens when you point your finger at somebody? I got 3 more pointed back at me, right? And I realized, hey, why are you here, schmuck? You're not an expert. And I began to say, okay, well, then why am I here, right? Because that's the first question you ask, right? Who am I? Why am I here? And I thought, I experienced something in my lifetime. Maybe I can share some of what I've experienced. And then somebody else hears something that's helpful to them, right? And so I heard the first two people talk, and they were talking about programs that they had created and how they'd organize their budget and their vestries, and all of a sudden I thought, oh, no, that's not it. That's not what's needed. And it became my turn to talk. And I said, okay, I want to tell you first off, take away the veil. There is no magic bullets or magic potions that is going to make you a successful church. You can have the best programs in the world. That's not going to get it. I remembered for them a talk I'd heard in seminary from Raymond Brown, a premier theologian, New Testament scholar. And for 2 days he talked about the New Testament. And he finished it up. He actually was the editor of the Jerusalem Bible, if you're familiar with it. So he's a pretty bright guy. And at the end of the story, he's telling a story about his Episcopal priest friend at the large downtown church, beautiful church, he said. And he and his friend were getting together for lunch one day. And his friend said to him, I don't understand it, Raymond. There's a church that started down 2 blocks away, and they're non-denominational. They're one of those make-your-own churches, right? You just kind of make up the way in which you present it. But it's still a church, nevertheless. And he says they're growing leaps and bounds. They got so many people coming there. They've already started work on this huge building. You haven't built anything yet. Come on, Chris. Get with it. Chop, chop. And they're building this huge building, right? This huge building, and here we are. We sit in the center of town. We have the best location. We have the finest stained glass windows that are in the area. We have an organ that costs $500,000. Wouldn't you like to have a $500,000 pipe organ? And our organist was trained at Berkeley School of Music in New York, right? It's one of the finest schools of music in the world. And our choir director is sought after to lead concerts all over the country. And he leads a 30-member choir. And I preach these really well-crafted sermons, much better than Steve Gruman over there in Alabama does. And I have thought about them for days, and when I present them with passion. He said, we've got programs that people call our program directors to lead conferences. And yet they're going by leaps and bounds. Have I missed something? What have I missed? And Raymond Brown said at that conference, he said, I looked at my friend and I said, you know, you can have the finest stained glass windows, you can have the nicest organ music program, you can have the best preaching, but if you don't have the love of Jesus, you got nothing, right? So we start with that. That's the essence. Love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Is that right? Is that what Jesus said? I'm not making this up. I'm telling you, Bill, is that right? Is that what the gospel says? So that's all that's needed, right? That's all that's needed. All that other stuff is not needed. So I told my vestry, I said, forget about money. Don't worry about money. Never let money be your problem. We ought to have a budget that's twice as big as we have now, and we will after stewardship this year. I promise you. Because giving is the heart of living a life like God. God gave everything he had for us. That's what Paul tells us in the letter to the Colossians today. That gift gives you something really incredible, really incredible. Read it again. Take it home, read it. The invisible God, the image of the invisible God came to earth, and he brought us the secrets of the universe that we might have as our own, as tools to live by. And he freed us from one thing. Look at it. Read it again. He freed us from being that person. He freed us from being that person. I don't want to be that person. I want to live in a way that reflects God's glory and brings other people to this richness of the gospel with joy as a byproduct, joy that will last and be sustainable forever. And that is good news. Those with ears to hear, let them hear.
From our faith as we rise facing the cross, we will recite the